94,000. When even Southerners like Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Henry Lawrence, and St. George Tucker publicly deplored the injustice of slavery, from that moment, declared the New York physician and abolitionist E.H. Smith in 1798, from that moment the slow but certain death wound was inflicted upon it. Everywhere, even in South Carolina, slaveholders began to feel defensive about slavery and to sense a public pressure against the institution that they had never felt before. In the aftermath of the Revolution, whites in Charleston expressed squeamishness about the evils of slavery, especially the public trading and punishment of slaves. In the 1780s, some of the Carolinian masters expressed a growing reluctance to break up families and even began manumitting their slaves, freeing more slaves in that decade than had been freed in the previous 3 decades. What helped to convince many people in the North that slavery's days were numbered was the promised ending of the despicable slave trade in 1808. Almost everywhere in the New World, slavery was dependent on the continued importation of slaves from Africa. Although this need for slaves from Africa was no longer true of the Upper South, South Carolina and Georgia were still importing slaves. The fact that the Deep South and the rest of the New World needed slave importations to maintain the institution deluded many Americans into believing that slavery in America was also dependent on the international slave trade, and that ending that slave trade would eventually end slavery itself. Those who held out that hope were utterly wrong, of course. They simply did not appreciate how demographically different North American slavery was from that in South America and in the Caribbean. They were blind to the fact that in most areas the slaves were approximating the growth of the whites, nearly doubling in number every 20 to 25 years, which was, by the way, the fastest growing population in the entire Atlantic world. Northerners had little or no appreciation that slavery in the South was a healthy, vigorous, and expansive institution. As far as they were concerned, the Virginia and Maryland planters, who had more slaves than they knew what to do with, were enthusiastically supporting an end to the international slave trade as the first major step in eliminating the institution of slavery itself. This assault on the overseas slave trade appeared to align the Chesapeake planters with the anti-slave forces in the North and confuse many Northerners about the real intentions of the Upper South, which was in fact in the business of exporting its surplus of slaves, mostly to the new areas of Mississippi and Alabama. All these developments misled many Americans and allowed them to postpone dealing with the issue. Like John Adams and Oliver Ellsworth, who was the third Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, they thought that the importation of when the importation of slaves was cut off, white laborers would become so numerous that the need for slaves would disappear. Slavery, said Ellsworth, in time will not be a speck in the country. In the meantime, the initial differences between the two sections were rapidly and dramatically increasing, becoming much more severe. During the 3 or 4 decades following the Revolution, the North and South grew much further apart. Both sections were Americans and Republican. Both professed a similar rhetoric of liberty and popular government, but beneath the surface, they were fast becoming very different places, with different cultures, different values, one coming to honor common labor as the supreme human activity, the other continuing to think of labor, manual labor, in traditional terms, as mean and despicable and fit only for slaves. When on the eve of the Civil War, the South complained that it had remained true to the 18th century republic and that it was the North that had changed, the South was correct. In the years immediately following the Revolution, the North was radically transformed, politically, economically, socially, and culturally. It was not that the population growth in the two sections were different, though by 1810 New York had surpassed Virginia as the largest state. It was the varied nature of the growth in the North. The northern states were building turnpikes and canals, creating banks and corporations, and greasing the growing internal trade with paper money to an extent simply not duplicated in the southern states. Everywhere in the northern states, farm families were busy buying and selling with each other. The society was still predominantly rural and agricultural, with no large manufacturing cities as in England, but in many northern towns, people seemed to be doing everything but farming. Take, for example, little town of Mount Pleasant in 1815, Mount Pleasant, Ohio, with a population of only 500 people, 500 persons. This little town had several dozen artisans and manufacturing shops, including 3 saddlers, 3 hatters, 4 blacksmiths, 4 weavers, 6 shoemakers, 3 cabinet makers, 1 baker, 1 apothecary, 1 wagon maker, 2 tanneries, 1 wool carding machine maker, 2 wool carding machinists, 1 wool spinning machinist, 1 flax spinner, and 1 nail factory. Within a 6-mile radius of this little town in Ohio were 9 merchant mills, 2 grist mills, 12 sawmills, 1 paper mill, 1 woolen factory, and 2 fulling mills. Little town, 500 people. There was nothing like this little town in Ohio in the South. The North was becoming the most highly commercialized society in the world. The North was becoming increasingly dominated by hosts of middling people, commercial farmers, mechanics, clerks, teachers, businessmen, and industrious, self-trained would-be professionals who celebrated work and the making of money to a degree unprecedented in the Western world. Now, this celebration of labor, especially manual labor, was important. We have to realize that ever since Aristotle, the ancient Greeks, leisured aristocrats and the professional classes had held labor, especially manual labor, and the making of money in contempt. Even someone who ran a business, say a printing business with 20 employees, and this was the case of Benjamin Franklin, was nonetheless considered to be involved with manual labor and thus contemptible, incapable of virtue, as Aristotle would said. These kinds of people could never exercise political leadership. Perhaps nothing separated the North and South more than their contrasting views of labor. The South, dominated as it was by leisured slaveholding planters, could scarcely conceive of labor as anything but despicable and shameful. Slavery, as it had for centuries, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, required a culture that held labor in contempt. Scorn for work and the holding of slaves are 2 sides of the same coin. The North developed very differently. In the several decades following the Revolution, the middling men of the North launched a wholesale campaign against aristocrats who had scorned them for ages. They urged each other to shed their earlier political apathy and accused all these gentlemen, who, as one critic said, were not under the necessity of getting their bread by industry, of being parasites, and of living off the labor of honest farmers and mechanics. Some of the same kind of feeling, I guess, that's being expressed by people in these cities now in the Wall Street protests. These leisured aristocrats who do not labor, but who enjoy in luxury the fruits of labor, as one critic said, had no right to decide the laws as they had in the past. Of course, these American aristocrats, these middling people attacked, were not European aristocrats. In the eyes of these middling sorts, these leisured aristocrats were what we today might label elites, mostly members of the professions, lawyers, judges, physicians, clergymen, government officials, anyone who was not involved with manual labor in one form or another. In the eyes of the middling sorts, artisans, clerks, businessmen, these elites seemed to do no real work. This celebration of labor inevitably made the South, with its leisured aristocracy supported by slavery, seem increasingly anomalous. In reaction, the Southern aristocrats began emphasizing their cavalier status in contrast to the money-grubbing Northern Yankees. They began claiming that they were the only true gentlemen left in America. It was not just the brutal fact of slavery that mattered, it was what slavery did to the society. Slavery in the South tended to create a different economy, politics, and culture from the North. While the North was coming to value labor as necessary and fit for all social ranks, much of the white population of the South was becoming more and more contemptuous of work and desirous of acquiring the leisure that slavery seemed to afford. Indeed, so great was the white cult of indolence that some Southerners began to worry about the discrepancy between an industrious North and a lethargic South. Where there is Negro slavery, one concerned Virginian told James Madison, there will be laziness, carelessness, and wastefulness. Not as much among the slaves as among the white masters, he said. This Virginian even claimed that our intelligent Negroes are far superior in mind, morals, and manners than those who are placed in authority over them. The South grew in population and prospered, but its culture and society remained traditional in many ways. During the antebellum decades, when the North was commercially exploding, the South remained essentially what it had been in the 18th century, a staple-producing slaveholding society. Cotton replaced tobacco and rice as the principal staples, but the society, the economy, and much of the politics remained roughly what they had been. Slavery determined the organization of the society. Now, when I read a book on Southern politics by the Harvard political scientist V.O. Key, I read it in the 1960s, at the same time I was studying American colonial history, I was struck by how similar the Southern political world of the 1930s that Key described was to the Southern world of the 18th century. They seemed to be identical. Now, the Southern states in the 1930s that Key described relied on mostly appointed local officials in county courts, with the state legislatures very much in control of the government. In the 1930s, there was no slavery in the South, but there was still a kind of sharecropping serfdom. But politically, the Southern states had not changed much since the 18th century. County court oligarchies still ran the show. In the antebellum South, not only did the wealthy slaveholding planters' management of the overseas marketing of a staple crop of cotton help to reinforce an unequal relationship of patrons and clients, but ultimately, and more important, their patriarchal system of slavery sustained a hierarchical society, a society that was very different from that of the northern states. The commercial institutions that were springing up in the North had few counterparts in the southern states. The South did not have the numbers of turnpikes, canals, banks, corporations, and issues of paper money that the North had. Fearing any interference with their peculiar institution, the planter-dominated legislatures kept government to a minimum. They taxed their citizens much less heavily and spent much less on education and social services than did the legislatures of the North. Although most Southern farmers were not slaveholders, and many of the plain folk of the South valued hard work as much as any ambitious Northern artisan, these ordinary Southerners could not give the same kind of enterprise, they could not give the same kind of enterprising middle-class tone to Southern society that existed in the North. There were fewer middling institutions in the South, fewer towns, fewer schools, fewer newspapers, fewer businesses, fewer manufacturing firms, and fewer shops. And there were fewer middling people in the South, fewer teachers, fewer clerks, fewer publishers, fewer editors, fewer engineers, fewer inventors, fewer patents. The antebellum South never became a middling, commercial-minded society like that of the North. Its patrician order of large slaveholders continued to dominate both the culture and the politics. As James Madison privately admitted in the 1790s, in proportion as slavery prevails in a state, the government, however democratic in form, must be hierarchical, must be aristocratic, in fact. As the North and South gradually grew apart, each section began expressing increasing frustration with the other, aggravating differences that had been, of course, present from the beginning of the Revolution. Northerners, especially New England Federalists, began to complain about what they saw as the unjustified Southern dominance of the federal government. They focused on the 3/5 clause of the Constitution that counted slaves as 3/5 of a person for assessing representation in the House of Representatives and, of course, the Electoral College. The Federalists charged that the 3/5 clause gave an unfair advantage to the Republicans, Jeffersonian Republicans, and was responsible for Jefferson's election in 1800. Thus was born the idea of the slave power that was unfairly usurping control of the national government from the free states. Even more unsettling to some Northerners was the gradual realization that slavery was not dying out in the South after all. The earlier enthusiasm of the Upper South to liberalize its slave system began to dissipate, especially following the news of the slave rebellion in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, that is, the Haitian rebellion in 1791. Gabriel's conspiracy in Virginia in 1800 further destroyed the hopes of many that Virginia was gradually eliminating slavery. The earlier leniency in judging freedom suits in Virginia ended, and manumissions in the state rapidly declined. Southerners now began reversing their earlier examples of racial mingling. Evangelical Protestant churches ended their practice of mixed congregations. And after 1800, the Southern states began enacting new sets of black codes that resemble later Jim Crow laws. tightening up the institution.